Hi, I just want to say that the audio is going to be kind of all over the place. I moved into a new place and was recording during different stages of the unpacking process, so the acoustics change a couple of times. So you've decided to start playing the Pokemon games and aren't quite sure where to start. Well, luckily for you, I've decided to waste my time to help you give money to Nintendo for free. Depending on how you want to count things, there's about 40 main series entries across the series' nearly 30-year history. And to make this number a little less daunting, if you have ever taken a math class, you are probably familiar with the concept of simplification. Simply put, there's closer to about 22 reasonably counted Pokemon games, or like 12 if you want to count unreasonably. Continuing that idea, the most common question you'll hear is, which version of Pokemon should I get? And here's the thing, this is not a very strange way of phrasing which entry should I begin with. And to explain what a Pokemon version is, I get to give a little history lesson because I want to. Way back in the Beyond times, before the invention of Pokemon, there were these things called beetles. These are a classification of insect notable for having 2 pairs of wings. And taking into consideration that apparently beetles take up about 25% of all known animal species, it's not actually having 2 pairs of wings it's notable. It's the fact that the front pair is basically a hardened shell for the back pair. So like a phone case or something. And there's a sport called beetle fighting. Despite what the name implies, this is really more so like 2 bugs pushing each other off of a stick. As far as I'm aware, this isn't really dangerous for either combatant, kind of what they do. And there's this guy called Satoshi Tajiri. As a child, he liked collecting bugs and watching anime. And with the help of Ken Sugimori and friends at Game Freak, they decided to make the video game version of catching bugs and making them push each other off of sticks. This translates to Professor Oak tasking the player with catching and researching the 150 Pokemon that inhabit their world. And a Pokemon is basically, it's a pocket monster. It's a portmanteau there. Pokemon are basically the animals of the world. They have an elemental affinity or two, you know, like water or fire or electricity or punching things really hard or being a bug. All good stuff. And there's about 15 types when the first Pokemon game comes out. Also, I've already lied to you, and that's because we're now answering the what version to get question. You see, there was never one Pokemon game. In the beginning, there was always 2. While earlier in development, there were plans for every copy to effectively be unique as a means of encouraging players to interact with each other. This ultimately proved to be too difficult, so instead the game was split into 2 separate versions, being Pokemon Red version and Green version. Once you get past the title screen, these games are pretty much the exact same, with the exception of certain Pokemon being exclusive to one game versus the other, and rarities being flip-flopped between versions. That is not to say there is no reason for 2 red players not to trade, as there are various instances where the player is asked to choose one of 2 or 3 Pokemon, necessitating that they communicate with any other player to finish their Pokedex. So this really amounts to, the decision is pretty much entirely arbitrary. Just look at the box, pick whichever one you like more. However, things are not quite so simple. They really are. I'm just going on a dumb little story time here. I don't really have a great segue, but you may have noticed that people usually refer to the first 2 Pokemon games as Red and Blue, and not Red and Green. The short and long of this is Pokemon Red and Green sold incredibly well, possibly because, you know, it forces a lot of interaction between Green. See, the 150th Pokemon is known as Mewtwo. As its name would imply, it is the second Mew, and despite being the first Pokemon that was copywritten, the original Mew was never supposed to appear in Red and Green, only mentioned by an optional piece of text. That is, until towards the end of development, Shigeki Morimoto decided to sneak it in at the last minute. And this basically meant that 12-year-olds could make up all sorts of rumors about the game, keeping it extremely popular and relevant. So, to celebrate 1 million copies of Red and Green being sold, Game Freak made Pokemon Blue. Blue was notable for a few things. First, Game Freak was aware there was actually 151 Pokemon now. 2, there was a good number of bug fixes. 3, they updated the artwork to look a good bit nicer. And 4, most importantly, they remixed what Pokemon were available. A few exclusives from Red and Green could both be found in Blue, certain one-of-a-kind Pokemon could be found in the wild, and a few Pokemon that were in both Red and Green were not found in blue, meaning that blue players would need to communicate with both red and green players if they wanted to catch all the Pokemon. And then there's an anime. Because of a delay to Pokemon 2, they made Yellow version, which readapts the anime back into the game. So there's a few story changes, updated art again, less bug. Notably, the player now has a Pikachu that will follow them in the overworld, among a few other changes. And now it's time for the international release. For the international release of Pokemon, you know, they took blue version, and then there was like a bunch of identity theft. Basically, blue version had the Pokemon available to it remixed once again to match the availabilities found in red and green. And then green version was renamed blue version, and then like a year later we got international yellow, which was basically Japanese yellow, except it could be in color if you played it on a Game Boy Color. So basically, the first like 5 years of Pokemon was re-releasing the same game 7 times. This group of games is commonly known as Generation 1, which is relevant because in 1992, we get Gold and Silver. These added like 100 new Pokemon, a new region, they added 2 new types in addition to a bit of rebalancing, they let Pokemon hold items, and the special stat has been split into a special attack and special defense. And once Crystal is basically like the yellow version of Gold and Silver, that's known as Generation 2. Now, jumping forward to 2002, we have Ruby and Sapphire. These give us more new Pokemon, another area to go to. Pokemon now have these things called abilities, which are basically passive skills, and they've reworked hold items to not be garbage. Those are basically abilities you can equip. There has also been a heavy rework of a bunch of back-end systems, which is why Generation 3 is basically considered the beginning of modern Pokemon. And in 2004, remakes of Red and Green are released as Fire Red and Leaf Green. And what's most notable about these is these basically take Red and Green and they bring them to the mechanical standard of what Ruby and Sapphire had, meaning that the new moves, types, Pokemon, abilities, items have been added to the original game. And then like the next year there's, you know, the blueversinification of Ruby and Sapphire, known as Emerald, adds a bunch of cool stuff. Generation 3, right? We're gonna stop talking about generations in super detail. That is to say, Pokemon games within the same generation are extremely similar mechanically, so you basically need to know within a generation if you're buying the original game or you're buying a remake, and if there is 3, pick whatever the third version is. It's usually better, however, 2009 was the last time we got. So let's move on to the point of this video. And I am working on the assumption you have some system in the Nintendo Switch family. You want to walk into a place that sells video games and walk out with a Pokemon game. This is going to break down to about mathematically 5 games and 3 bonus, with the bonus games being they aren't released on the Switch yet. Technically 2 of them are GameCube games, so they are available, but they just aren't on the Switch 2 yet. And I think it's unreasonable to ask you to deal with trying to find used games or eBay, or like stealing it, I guess. Anyway, let's cut to the chase here. So the games we have in question are Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee. These are remakes of Pokemon Yellow that run off of the Generation 7 engine. Aside from the fact I don't know how many layers deep into being remakes of remakes, the point is these games are the Pokemon Goification of a main series game. Then we have Pokemon Sword and Shield. These are the first original Pokemon games for the Switch, and they mark the start of the 8th generation of Pokemon. Then we have Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. These are remakes of the original Diamond and Pearl for the Nintendo DS, so basically these are Generation 4 remakes in the Generation 8 engine. Up next we have Pokemon Legends Arceus, also Generation 8. This is an action RPG title we've got. It's restructuring many aspects to put a greater emphasis on world exploration and Pokemon research. Then we have Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. These are our 3rd original Pokemon games, and they are the start of Generation 9. They've got a more non-linear structure and are open world, and they reintegrate aspects of Legends Arceus back into a more standard experience. And for our bonus games, we have Pokemon Legends ZA. It'll be on both Switch 1 and 2. It appears to be a follow-up of the first set of 3DS games, probably not that important, but it's putting a greater emphasis on battling from what we can tell. And our other 2 bonus games are like 20 years old. It's Pokemon Coliseum and Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness. These were GameCube spin-offs that are basically considered honorary core series games. Their whole gimmick is that you can't find wild Pokemon and that you have to steal brainwashed Pokemon from trainers and cure them. They will eventually be made available through the GameCube games on Nintendo Switch, but we are not there yet. They're available through the Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack, only on Switch 2, and a GameCube. I'm including them because they're basically a main series game and they're going to be readily available. They are being relegated to bonus games because a lot of the information I'm about to go over doesn't necessarily apply the same to them. So if I don't want to like talk about something specifically, I'll probably just throw something up on screen, talk about how these might be different. So basically, I'm going to give you a couple spectrums and I'm going to talk about where I line these up in there, and then hopefully you can make some decision at that point. So up first, we have our most simple to our most complex game. So the most common thing you'll be doing in a Pokemon game is battling Pokemon, and it's a relatively straightforward thing, at least for what you absolutely need to know to make everything work. At the end of the day, your goal is to knock out all of your opponent's Pokemon, and in the case of a wild Pokemon, it could be to catch it, which you need to not knock them out first. When I was talking about the differences between generations, I mentioned stats, abilities, items, things like that. So we're going to give a super brief rundown. If you've ever played a tabletop RPG, it is probably best to think of Pokemon as different types of classes. There is health, which is self-explanatory, attack and defense, which I also think are self-explanatory. Then we have special attack and defense. These are basically just magic attack and defense. And then there's speed, which determines when the Pokemon's turn is. On top of that, every Pokemon has an ability, and they have a move pool. While there is variation between individuals, the species is generally the most important determining factor in what a Pokemon do. While an individual can only have one ability, the species itself can have usually three, two that are common and one that is more difficult to get a hold of. As previously mentioned, abilities are basically just passive skills a Pokemon can have. Items are mechanically about the same thing, except they are equipable, and a Pokemon can only hold one item at a time. Of a species move pool, an individual can know up to 4 moves at any given time, usually with the only requirement being that they have reached a certain level before, though there are a few alternate learning methods. And regarding types, any species must have one but can have up to 2 different types. This is less prevalent, but some species have alternate form. For the most part, these are like minor tweaks and variations upon pre-existing Pokemon. I'm now going to talk about the single most scary aspect of playing Pokemon as a new person. That is types. There's 18 of them. Don't worry, you do not need to memorize how these all interact with each other. Types are basically just damage modifiers. Aside from attack power and accuracy, there are 2 main things to consider when choosing moves. That is the type of damage they are dealing and how they are dealing it. To go over the simpler one first, there are 2 main ways that damage is dealt. Every move that does damage is either a physical move or a special move, as indicated by this icon. This is done on a per move basis as of the original Diamond and Pearl. Prior to this, a move was physical or special depending on what its type was. What is a type? These are basically just defensive modifiers. All 18 types interact with each other in one of 4 different ways. They either have no effect, in which the defending type is immune. They are not very effective, meaning that the defending type is going to take half damage. There is effective, meaning that it takes full damage. And then there is super effective, meaning that the defending type is going to take double damage. With one exception, all damaging moves only have one type. When a defending Pokemon has 2 types, these modifiers will multiply together. So, to provide an example, Charizard is a fire flying type. And just to clarify, the order of a Pokemon's types are entirely for flavor. So a fire flying and a flying fire are mechanically the exact same thing. Fire is weak to ground, but flying is immune, meaning that a ground type move deals 0 damage. Both fire and flying resist grass types, so Charizard would take quarter damage. Fire resists steel type and flying has a neutral interaction, so Charizard takes half damage. Fire resists ice, but flying is weak to ice, meaning that Charizard would take regular damage. Fire is weak to water, and flying type has a neutral interaction, so Charizard would take double damage. Both fire and flying are weak to rock, so Charizard takes quadruple damage, dies, and has to have a closed casket funeral. Pokemon don't actually die in battle, they explicitly faint, so it's all chill. Once again, Pokemon just like doing this. It's enrichment for them. While Pokemon can learn moves outside of their own type, it is recommended that they know at least one attacking move of their own type, as it will receive the same type attack or stab bonus, which deals an additional 50% damage. Some types do have additional properties, such as ghost types always being able to swap out or escape. The games do ease you into using types, and all of the games made for the Switch will tell you how effective a move will be, so long as you've encountered that Pokemon species before. It's still worth learning the type chart, as this does not take things such as double weakness, double resistance, stab, or ability-based modifications into account. Also, there's like status moves. These are just weird moves that do other stuff. They have types, but they're generally not affected by the type chart. Wasn't sure where else to throw that in. And once again, not having a good segue, Pokemon do this thing called evolving. They basically go from one species to another. The species they can turn into is determined by whatever species they currently are. More common ways that Pokemon can evolve is through level up, evolutionary stones, which are basically an item that you use on the Pokemon, and it does not require being any specific level. And then trading. Similarly, trading is not dependent on level. However, there have been variations of leveling up and trading, usually trading being hold an item, or trade for another specific Pokemon, and level up changing the meet a certain prerequisite level to being you need to meet some other condition, such as time of day or location, or being good buddy old palios with your Pokemon. Evolution stones, I guess, have gotten more complicated. They've basically just made a bunch of species-specific evolutionary stones. Like there's this apple worm thing. It has like 3 different apples you can use to evolve it with. And the last method I'm just going to call stupid fucking bullshit. It's basically stuff you have to Google, usually a variation upon leveling up, but it's stuff you gotta Google. For example, reach a certain level requirement and then flip your system upside down, or take a certain amount of damage and then walk under a stone archway in a certain location. Just bizarre thing. Finally, there's like per game gimmick. That's enough so I can move on to why the crap a simple game is simple. So, the simplest games we have are Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. This is basically because these games are the bridge between Pokemon Go and main series. A few things they do to streamline things is they have removed abilities and hold items, and they've cut down the number of Pokemon available. It's basically the original 151, plus a couple of extras, but these extras basically don't show up until like the end of the game or until the post game. What simplifies these games is the fact that almost every wild Pokemon encounter is a Go-style catching thing, and battles are almost exclusively limited to trainer. It basically streamlines the whole process. Up next on our chopping block, I'm adding Legends Arceus. Once again, hold items and abilities are missing. Due to the refocus on exploration and researching Pokemon, battles are much less emphasized in this game, though they have been slightly reworked to use like a quasi-turn-based timer thing. The best way to describe this is that eventually every Pokemon can learn like a fast and a strong version of a move, and this will affect what order turns are happening in, usually with it just amounting to maybe someone can get 2 turns in. This game also features weather. It is outside of the player control, but basically it amounts to, depending on the situation, certain types of moves or Pokemon will have an interaction with the weather. It might make a move stronger, could make them weaker, it could punish them for being a certain type, it could give them a buff for being a certain type. It's not so prominent that you really need to worry about it. Anyways, that's about it for Legends Arceus. It's pretty straightforward, I think. And then we have Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl in the middle of our complexity scale. It's basically they use everything that modern games do, but as remakes of Generation 4, where its big gimmick at the time was splitting moves into being physical or special on an individual basis. That was kind of the gimmick, and it's just, the standard. This is also the point on the complexity scale where we are able to mess with things like weather and terrain, which is like weather but for the ground, and like other battlefield conditions. These are really cool, but random trainers don't really ever use them, so you don't have to like really worry about it too much. Honestly, everything that sounds complex, you don't have to worry about because they don't ever use it. Oh yeah, also there are double battles where each side can have 2 Pokemon out at a time. These are cool, but severely underutilized. Up next, we've got Sword and Shield. General navigation is super easy because everything's like a corridor here, but you do get some fun mechanics to mess around with. You got the open world section, pretty cool. It's not really ever required that you run through except for a couple of times. But yeah, so the gimmick of this game is something called Dynamaxing. Basically, you make your Pokemon really big, and when they're really big, their moves will always hit, and they like kind of have double defenses. The way that it's done is that basically it will double their health, and then when they revert back to normal, their health will scale. So let's just say you have a Pokemon, it has 2 health, you make it big, it's now got 4 health. Nothing else about it has changed, so when it gets hit, it's still gonna take like 2 points of damage, but it had 4, so it's fine. And when it goes back to normal size, its defenses are gonna drop by scaling its health back down to 1 point. The moves also have like a set secondary effect depending on what type they are whenever you use them. This is pretty much exclusively used in like multiplayer functionality and when you're fighting gyms, which are like the type specialists. Lastly, we have Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. These are because the world is now open, so you kind of run around and it's non-linear. Pretty cool. Mechanically, these have about all the same stuff going on that Sword and Shield did. The main difference is that instead of turning your Pokemon into Godzillas, you have terrestrialization, which is basically just changing their type. Every Pokemon has a Terra type. It can be any type, though normally it is one of their 2 standard types. Once you terrestrialize the Pokemon, it changes into whatever its Terra type is, and it gains stab on moves of its Terra type, while retaining moves on stab that qualified previous. Or if it terrestrializes into a type that it already has, the relevant moves will get an extra layer of stab. Changing a Pokemon's type does have a pretty significant impact on how it's used. Additionally, if you have a second Joy-Con or Pokeball Plus, another player can waggle the controller around, and they will jump in as a support trainer. This effectively converts almost every battle into a one-sided double battle, where the player gets to use 2 Pokemon from their party on the field at a time, though each player pulls from the same pool of resources. Up next, I'm putting Legends Arceus, as the focus on research means that a lot of experience can be gained outside of battle. Similarly, this game also lacks hold items and ability, removing that layer of complexity. And while TMs are not present, Pokemon are able to relearn moves at any time at no cost. Additionally, defeating or capturing certain Pokemon rewards experience candies, which when fed to a Pokemon provides a specific amount of experience depending on the candy's size. There's also a similar older item called the Rare Candy that when fed to a Pokemon gives them enough experience to reach the next level. I do want to point out that when I say this is the second easiest game, that is exclusively in reference to the general battling difficulty. There are multiple points throughout the game where the player is tasked with calming a frenzied Pokemon. These segments are much more actionized, as battle mechanics are optional during these portions, and they instead focus on the player's ability to dodge while tossing items at the frenzied Pokemon. If these segments were more common, I would probably put this at like the most or second most difficult spot. And now for our mid tier, we have Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. This is largely because the non-linear structure allows players to quickly swap to another task when they feel overwhelmed with the first. Similar to Legends Arceus, level up moves can be relearned at any time. Scarlet and Violet have consumable TMs, but the materials to get more TMs are pretty easy to get a hold of. There's also alternate ways of getting experience outside of standard battles. The first is Auto Battle. Basically, it's a super simplified thing where you press one button and your Pokemon wins or loses. It takes like 3 seconds for a battle to end, though you do get less experience. However, it is a really easy way to farm materials for TM. You can also make sandwiches that give you more experience for battling certain types of Pokemon. There are also Terra Raids. These are cooperative battles with up to 3 other players, where you work with the other trainers to fight a terrestrialized Pokemon within a time limit. And if successful, you get to catch the Pokemon and are rewarded with items, which include but are not limited to experience and rare candies. This provides ways to get decently powerful Pokemon with a useful Terra type, or a means of fast-tracking leveling up a Pokemon you just added to your party. Next we have Pokemon Sword and Shield. I want to say generally these are about the same level of difficulty, however the ability to remix your team is not as convenient. While relearning moves is still free, you can only do it at Pokemon Centers. Heyo, it's time for the first bonus category. I don't know where Legend ZA is going to be. Let's just toss it at the end here because it looks like it focuses on battling more. And then we have the OR game. These are just going to be the most difficult, and this amounts to the fact that they are GameCube games, meaning they run off of the Generation 3 engine, meaning a lot of quality of life features have not been implemented yet. TMs are rare and consumable. You only gain experience if you are in battle. We are running off of an older type chart. All Pokemon basically suffer from I don't learn any moves-itis, and because of story regions, there are extremely limited options for what Pokemon you can catch. Additionally, there is the fact that all of the battles are double battles, which are inherently more complicated and require more planning. Though I understand that Gale of Darkness is considered to have better difficulty scaling, it tends to lean on being significantly easier than Colosseum, which has decent level scaling until the end where you just have to level grind a lot. Alright, it's time for our next category. How multiplayerable is the game? So, by default, all Pokemon games have trading in them, and like battling other players. For our most single player game, I'm going to put the OR games, mostly because these are generally built on being a single player experience. While technically you can transfer to the Game Boy Advance games, the conversation is about what is available on Switch 1 and 2. It would be really cool, and I hope you can move your Pokemon to Pokemon Home, but I'm kind of doubting that will happen. Though I do believe both games have a battle now where each player is just given a random set of Pokemon to use. I'm assuming ZA and Arceus are going to be tied here. Arceus basically just has trading. You can't fight other players. The most you can do is you can find their bag. Then we have Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl. You can go to like the Grand Underground and run around and maybe see each other. It feels honestly a little lamer than the original games. Also generally side content. Then we have Sword and Shield. You guys can run around the open world parts of the game together. You don't really interact unless you're doing raids together. Then there is Scarlet and Violet. You can once again do raids together, but you can also form a union circle where you hang out in each other's world. While within a union circle you can't like directly battle or help the other player, you are able to see each other and can catch the Pokemon spawned by the other player, meaning that you can catch a Scarlet exclusive Pokemon in Violet if you are playing with a Scarlet player. There are also raids again. And then at the top we have Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. I mentioned that there was a co-op mode that absolutely destroys the game's difficulty. And now it is time for our super silly categories with Larry. Up next is, can you go to Pokemon America? Basically every area in the Pokemon games are based off of a real world location. The first 4 regions were just parts of Japan rotated. Starting in our Can You Go to America, in our No tier we have Legends Arceus and Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl. These both take place in the Sinnoh region, or Hisui if you're in the past, like in Legends Arceus. This is Japan, but rotated. I think one of these is supposed to take place before what is technically Pokemon America even existed. However, you can catch the Pokemon Hawaii Vulpix, though historically it probably was not part of Pokemon America yet. Then we have Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. These take place in the Kanto region, but rotated. Also, the region is just called Kanto. While you cannot go to Pokemon America in this game, there is a heavy focus on them and being able to get the Alolan forms, which are Pokemon Hawaii forms of Pokemon, so that counts for something. And then we have Pokemon Legends ZA, which, unless they lied to us, you're stuck in Pokemon Paris, so no Pokemon America there. Though the existence of Liberty Garden in Pokemon New York does imply the potential existence of a Pokemon Statue of Liberty or equivalent, which was from France, so, who knows. Next we have Sword and Shield. These take place in Pokemon England, which is basically proto-Pokemon America. Now, this is where things start to get good. In Scarlet and Violet, despite taking place in the Paldea region, which is based off the Iberian Peninsula, meaning it is Pokemon Spain and Portugal, through the use of the DLC, you can go to the land of Kitakami, which is basically Pokemon Japan Part 75. However, more importantly, the second part of the DLC lets you go to the Blueberry Academy, which is in Pokemon America, specifically Pokemon New York, except if it was a school and was actually Atlantis, like Disney's Atlantis, where it's a giant bubble underwater. And then we have the Ore game. These take place in Pokemon Arizona Desert, and feature things such as Diner made out of a locomotive, cowboy music, a one-wheeled Harley-Davidson, jailbreaking Pokeballs, political and corporate corruption, the money explicitly being referred to as dollars. This is where I start inserting things that I remembered and forgot to do. Really quick, there are a number of ways that Pokemon can learn moves. While primarily through level up, they can also be born knowing a move or have been taught it. And Pokemon are taught moves in 2 ways, either through a tutor, which is a random character or another Pokemon, or through the use of an item called a technical machine, or TM for short. For the first decade and a half of Pokemon, TMs were rare items that were consumable and effectively 1 per game, and their main purpose was to teach Pokemon moves outside of what they learned through level up. Additionally, in older Pokemon games, certain moves would need to be known by members of your party in order to explore the world, and these moves would be learned through an item called a hidden machine, or HM for short. They are effectively the same thing as a TM, except they have infinite uses, and for getting a move learned through an HM typically required talking to a specific character. And in 2010, or Generation 5, or games that take place in Pokemon New York, Game Freak decided that TMs should be infinite use now, and HMs started to get phased out around time. And in 2019, with the release of Sword and Shield, technical records, or TRs, were introduced. These are basically a more common version of how TMs used to work. And these were effectively immediately phased out, as in 2022, Scarlet and Violet make TMs consumables again. However, they are now a renewable resource. I am now talking about difficulty. If I did not talk about Sword and Shield, the primary reason that I am putting Sword and Shield on the more difficult than Scarlet and Violet, while these are the games that introduced raids, their implementation is much more difficult relative to their successors. Instead of a time limit, there is now a strict 10 turn limit or 4 knockouts on the player's side. The biggest thing is that, especially during higher level raids, the AI allies are consistently an active detriment. There are also significantly less available raids per day. There is Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl, Of the 5 games we're focusing on, these are getting the most difficult, mainly due to how weird the difficulty curve is, and this is largely a result of a half commitment to wanting to be faithful remakes of the original Diamond and Pearl. So while a number of quality of life features around team building are reverted back to how they were in the original games, this is overshadowed by the fact that a lack of rebalancing means that the player has about 3.5 times more experience, meaning that for the most part the game is a breeze and significantly easier than the originals, that is up until the end of the game, where the last few trainers are effectively using team builds and strategies that would not be out of place in a high-level competition. And this is after effectively getting through the entire game through sheer brute force. And here's where I mention Sword and Shield for multiplayer stuff, because I forgot to do that earlier. Basically, these are going a bit lower than Scarlet and Violet. In addition to the standard battling and trading, players can also do raids together, and I believe players can see each other in the open world sections of the game, but that's about it. Okay, I think that's everything. I spent way too freaking long doing all of this, and I overthought this for like 4 months, so we're just crapping this video out. That's the outro, by the way, so peace out. Maybe I'll see you again in like less than 6 months.